Hey, welcome everybody. I am really happy that I'm getting to sit down with my good friend, Jared Nichols. Jared and I go way back. We first met back in college. We went to school together at a small private school in North Georgia. We lived in an intentional house church community together, and we were briefly in the same graduate program together, this degree in this really weird, interesting field called Futures Studies or Strategic Foresight. It's a program that sadly I stalled out of with the birth of my first child, but Jared completed, and that's part of what we're going to be chatting about today.
Yeah. Well, hello everybody. It's great to be here, Mike.
Yeah, totally. So you might be wondering, like, what is strategic foresight? And the way that I always described it when I was in the program, and it still comes up surprisingly often in my everyday life, is that strategic foresight is both an art and a science of looking at a range of possible future scenarios using both qualitative tools and quantitative tools. So it's a way of like thinking about the future and using those tools and using your imagination to create the future that you want to see. And this can work with organizations of all kinds, and it can even work with individuals, with us thinking about our own lives. So there's like a set of tools that puts the future more in our hands than we tend to think. Because I know that my default is to think I'm just like a victim of future forces. They're just sort of coming at me, and like I can kind of tread water as best I can. But there's actually a really interesting and formidable toolkit that can really help us navigate those waters. What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think in the most simple way of looking at strategic foresight, it's the ability to envision how the future might unfold. Again, not predicting the future, because nobody can truly predict the future. But it's the ability to envision how the future might unfold, and then using that to modify your behavior today, to change what you're doing today so that you can not just prepare for some future, but so that you can create the future that you want to see. And I laugh about that a lot because I know it sounds like a great poster for inspiration, like create the future you want to see, but it's something you can actually do. It's about being an active participant and driving the kind of change that you want to see, rather than being either, like you said, sitting back and being a victim of this thing called the future that's coming at them, or putting all their time and energy into creating somebody else's version of the future. We see a lot of that today now with these dominant overarching narratives, whether it's political, religious, economic, and we see people moving into their camps because they're allowing somebody else's idea to drive their actions.
Yeah.
And so foresight's value is really in empowering more people to step back and really ask better questions.
Yeah, and when we allow ourselves to be driven by other people's futures, it kind of narrows the spectrum of what we see as possible. It silos us into limited ways of thinking.
Yeah.
One thing that I remember doing as a futurist in training was scenario building, where we were imagining these different futures, and a lot of times even that was kind of siloed. Like we can basically extrapolate today into tomorrow with incremental changes. And so, our teachers knew that, and they gave us this gift, what they called wildcard futures, where we were like, let's just imagine something potentially outlandish by looking for weak signals of change now, that what if this really mushroomed? Yeah. How would that look? And I feel like the last 2 years especially, we've been living in the wildest of wildcard futures. And so I'm wondering if we could actually chat about that a little bit. Like, the people who I'm friends with and the people who connect with me online, you're mostly ministers, you're artists, you're activists, you're change makers. And we're all feeling pretty overwhelmed, even I am, by the pace of change, just like the daily headlines that come in our current social and political context. Like, everything could change. Not to date it too much, but as we're recording, like, our government has been shut down for the longest it's ever been shut down in history. And we don't think of that as something that can happen in the United States. So, like, what is in your toolkit that can help us, especially if we're coming from like a spiritual background or a faith background, to navigate this kind of change?
Yeah, so on the topic of wildcards, I think that's a great example. And I'll back up, I'll come right back to that. But I think first we have to establish, here's the foundation. Most of the overwhelm comes from being told what the future is going to be, being told what to think about the future. And that's where the problem is. So instead, where my work is and what I've really focused on is teaching people how to think about the future. Because at the end of the day, wild cards come when you're in that silo. Wild cards are those unexpected events that have high impact. And the reason that they're wild cards is because people in general have not been trained or taught how to think about the future. They've been told, here's what the future is going to be, now prepare for it. And that's has plenty of problems in and of itself.
Right.
You know, because you're being pulled in 50 different directions. But if more people knew how to think about the future, then they could look beyond, for example, when it comes to a technology or a trend, they could look beyond the original audience for whom it was intended, and then they can look beyond the original intention for that. The example I like to use a lot to show just how you could identify these wild card events or these possibilities is by looking at the example of Facebook. Obviously, Facebook, 2003, 2004 is really starting to, most people still hadn't heard of Facebook. 2004, 2005, it comes out, it's a dating hookup, who's dating who type of thing for Ivy League college kids. And less than 10 years later, it's the #1 tool used to overthrow 30+ year dictatorship in the Middle East. Now, you'd be hard pressed to convince me that Mark Zuckerberg was sitting there thinking, this is great. We know if Billy and Sally are still dating, but just wait till this thing starts overthrowing governments. But
that's my measure of success.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that he was thinking about that. But but wild cards come when we're staying in our lane and we're just looking at one thing. We're not asking questions about how trends and issues that we see today may impact multiple facets of society. And that all comes down to this: if we know how to think, then we feel free to ask questions like, how might artificial intelligence impact the way that we view arts and entertainment, right? I mean, artificial intelligence already, we talked about this back in our program, artificial intelligence already has created facial structures and people,
right,
just by using aggregate data of people's features. These are not real people, but they look like real people. AI is already doing that. AI is already, being able to create scripts for movies. So we're already moving into that realm, and things keep happening so much faster. But rather than feeling like a victim, if we just know how to ask questions and look beyond its original intent, then we can start to see an entirely new type of possibility open up.